saving a pit bull that was drowning. Minutes later, the man received unexpected news. A peaceful morning walk by the lake turned into a race against time when Ethan spotted a pit bull struggling to stay afloat in the icy water. Without hesitation, he leapt in, risking everything to save the helpless dog. But just as he caught his breath on the shore, an unexpected phone call changed his life forever. Before we dive into this emotional story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this story, and if you have a heartwarming tale about your own dog to share. We'd love to hear it. Ethan had always found solace in his morning walks by the lake. The stillness, the soft chirping of birds, and the cool morning air were the perfect antidote to the chaos of life. But this morning was different. As he walked the familiar path, something caught his attention, a faint, splashing sound, followed by desperate whimpers. He quickened his pace, scanning the water, and then he saw it. A pit bull, struggling to stay afloat in the icy lake. The dog's head bobbed up and down, its strength clearly fading. Ethan froze for a split second, his mind racing. There was no one else around, no time to call for help. Without a second thought, he shrugged off his jacket, kicked off his boots, and dove into the freezing water. The cold hit him like a wall, stealing his breath and numbing his limbs. But he pushed forward. The dog's eyes met his, a mix of fear and hope, and that was all the motivation Ethan needed. "I've got you," he muttered through chattering teeth as he swam closer. The dog thrashed weakly, its energy almost gone. Ethan wrapped one arm around it, using the other to pull them back toward the shore. The journey back felt endless. Every muscle in his body screamed from the effort, the cold sapping his strength. But after what felt like an eternity, his feet found the lake bed. Gasping for air, he staggered onto the rocky shore, collapsing with the dog in his arms. The pit bull lay still, its body trembling violently. "Hey, stay with me," Ethan urged, his voice breaking. He wrapped his jacket around the dog, rubbing its fur to generate warmth. Its breathing was shallow, but it was alive. Relief washed over Ethan as he looked into the dog's tired eyes. "You're safe now." As the adrenaline began to wear off, Ethan reached for his phone to call for help. Just as he pulled it from his soaked jeans, it buzzed in his hand. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. Frowning, he hesitated, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Ethan, it's Officer Martinez," the voice on the other end said. "I'm calling about your brother, Daniel." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The officer's tone was grave, and the weight of his words made Ethan's chest tighten. "There's been an accident. I need you to come to St. Mary's Hospital right away." The phone nearly slipped from Ethan's hand. His mind raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at the dog, still shivering but alive, and then back at the lake, where the morning sun reflected off the water as if nothing had happened. "I'll be there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He ended the call and stared at the pit bull. "What now?" he muttered. The dog, as if sensing his turmoil, shifted slightly and rested its head on his lap. Ethan sighed. "Looks like we're in this together, huh?" With trembling hands, he pulled himself to his feet, cradling the dog in his arms. He wasn't sure how he was going to explain any of this to the hospital staff, but he couldn't leave the dog behind, not after what they had just been through. As he made his way back to his truck, the weight of the dog in his arms was a strange comfort. It reminded him that life, no matter how fragile, was worth fighting for. And in that moment, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that saving the pit bull wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was the start of something much bigger. Ethan pulled his truck into the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital, his heart pounding with dread. The officer's words replayed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. But beside him, the pit bull sat curled in the passenger seat, wrapped in his jacket. The dog's trembling had eased, though its eyes were still wide with fear and exhaustion. "Hang in there, buddy," Ethan said softly, reaching over to scratch the dog's damp ears. For a moment, he allowed himself to focus on the dog instead of the unknown waiting for him inside the hospital. He needed to figure out what to do next, for both of them. The automatic door slid open as Ethan stepped into the hospital lobby, the cold air clinging to his damp clothes. A nurse at the front desk looked up, her eyebrows lifting at the sight of the shivering dog in his arms. "Sir, is that—" "I found him drowning in the lake," Ethan said quickly. "I couldn't just leave him. But I need to see my brother, Daniel Harper. I was told he's here." The nurse hesitated before nodding. "He's in surgery. Someone will come speak to you soon." She glanced at the dog again, her expression softening. "You might want to get him checked out, too. There's a vet clinic a few blocks from here." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, his mind spinning. Surgery. The word felt heavy and ominous. He settled into one of the waiting room chairs, the dog still cradled in his lap. Despite the chaos around them, the pit bull's presence was strangely grounding. The dog shifted slightly, resting its head on Ethan's arm. Minutes turned into an hour. Ethan's damp clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by worry about his brother, about the dog, about everything. Finally, a doctor appeared in the doorway, her expression neutral, but tired. Ethan's stomach tightened as she approached. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. Ethan stood, the dog shifting in his arms. "Yes. How's Daniel?" The doctor sighed. "He was in a car accident, pretty severe. He's stable for now, but his injuries are serious. We'll know more once he's out of surgery." She paused, glancing at the dog. "Is that yours?" Ethan shook his head. "No. I found him this morning, drowning in the lake. I couldn't leave him." The doctor gave a small, understanding smile. "Well, it seems like he found you too. Hang in there, Mr. Harper. We'll keep you updated." As the doctor walked away, Ethan sank back into his seat. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, but the pit bull's steady breathing reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. After another hour, Ethan decided to take the nurse's advice. The dog needed care, and waiting around wouldn't make time move faster. He carried the pit bull back to his truck, driving a short distance to the vet clinic. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Willis, greeted them with a warm smile. "Looks like you've had quite the adventure," she said, kneeling to examine the dog. "Yeah," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I found him in the lake. He was barely hanging on." Dr. Willis nodded, her hands gentle as she checked the dog's vitals. "He's lucky you got to him in time. He's malnourished and has some bruising, but nothing life-threatening." She looked up, her gaze curious. "Are you planning to keep him?" Ethan hesitated. The thought hadn't fully crossed his mind. I don't know. I wasn't planning on adopting a dog today." "Well," Dr. Willis said with a smile, "he seems to have adopted you." The dog, as if on cue, nudged its head against Ethan's hand. A faint smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "I guess we'll see." As he left the clinic, Ethan felt an odd sense of comfort. The pit bull, now clean and with a temporary bandage on one paw, wagged its tail faintly as they walked to the truck. Ethan opened the passenger door and the dog jumped in with surprising energy. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan said, chuckling softly. He slid into the driver's seat, his smile fading as he remembered where they were headed next. The hospital loomed in the distance, and with it, the weight of everything still unknown. For now, though, he focused on the moment. The dog, now snuggled into the seat beside him, let out a soft sigh. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Ethan that even in the darkest times, there were small glimmers of hope. Ethan parked his truck back at the hospital, his heart heavy with the weight of his brother's condition. He glanced at the pit bull sitting beside him, now looking slightly more alert but still timid. The connection he felt with the dog was undeniable. There was something unspoken between them, an understanding of shared survival. "You stay here, okay?" Ethan said, patting the dog's head. The pit bull whimpered softly, but stayed put as Ethan climbed out of the truck and locked the doors. Inside the hospital, Ethan returned to the waiting room, where a nurse informed him that his brother was still in surgery. The hours stretched on endlessly. Ethan's mind wandered to Daniel, replaying childhood memories of the two of them, exploring the very lake where he had saved the dog earlier that morning. The thought was bittersweet, especially now that his brother's fate was uncertain. The pit bull was never far from his thoughts either. Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Willis, the veterinarian. "Don't forget, hydration is key for recovery. Let me know if you have any questions." The message made Ethan smile faintly. She must have sensed he wasn't the type to let the dog go. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor returned. Her expression was serious, though not hopeless. "Mr. Harper, your brother is out of surgery," she said. "The next 24 hours are critical, but he's stable. You can see him briefly, but he won't be awake for a while." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. When Ethan finally entered his brother's room, the sight of Daniel lying motionless on the hospital bed hit him hard. Machines beeped rhythmically, and an IV dripped steadily into Daniel's arm. Ethan sat in the chair beside the bed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Hey, Danny," he said softly. "You're going to pull through this. You have to. You're all I've got left." His voice cracked, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. As Ethan sat there, his thoughts shifted back to the pit bull waiting in the truck. It struck him how similar their situations were, both fighting against overwhelming odds, both needing someone to believe in them. When visiting hours ended, Ethan returned to his truck. The dog perked up at the sight of him, its tail thumping weakly against the seat. Ethan opened the door, and the dog leaned forward to nuzzle his hand. "Miss me, huh?" Ethan said with a soft chuckle. The dog's response was a quiet whine, as though it understood the gravity of the day. Back at home, Ethan carried the pit bull inside, laying down blankets in the corner of the living room. The dog sniffed its new surroundings cautiously before settling down, curling into a tight ball. Ethan sat nearby, leaning against the couch. The silence was comforting, but his mind was restless. As the hours ticked by, Ethan found himself scrolling through photos on his phone, pictures of him and Daniel fishing at the lake, working on cars, and laughing over beers on the porch. Life had felt simpler then, before accidents and surgeries and the unexpected responsibility of saving a drowning dog. "Life's funny, huh?" Ethan said aloud, glancing at the pit bull. The dog lifted its head, watching him with those soulful eyes. Ethan sighed, leaning back. "I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, but for now, I guess we're in this together." Later that night, Ethan was startled awake by the sound of whining. The pit bull was pacing by the door, its movements frantic. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, getting to his feet. The dog pawed at the door, its behavior growing more agitated. Ethan frowned, his exhaustion giving way to concern. Grabbing a flashlight, he opened the door, and the dog bolted outside. Ethan followed, shivering in the cool night air. The dog stopped at the edge of the driveway, barking into the darkness. Ethan scanned the area with his flashlight, unsure of what the dog had sensed. That's when he saw it. A small bundle near the base of the tree, shivering and weak. As he approached, Ethan realized it was a kitten, barely alive and soaked from the dew. The pit bull nudged the kitten gently with its nose, whining softly. "Well, aren't you full of surprises?" Ethan muttered, scooping up the kitten. The pit bull wagged its tail, looking up at Ethan as if to say, "See? We couldn't leave it behind." Back inside, Ethan dried the kitten off and made a small bed for it next to the pit bull's blankets. The dog curled protectively around the tiny creature, letting out a contented sigh. Ethan watched them for a moment, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the heaviness in his heart. "Guess you're teaching me something about second chances," he said quietly. For the first time that day, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the dog or the kitten, but for himself and Daniel too. The next morning brought a quiet stillness to Ethan's small home. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting warm streaks across the living room floor. The pit bull lay sprawled out on the blankets, the tiny kitten tucked close against its side. It was a sight Ethan couldn't help but smile at, a picture of peace in a life that felt anything but. He sipped his coffee at the kitchen counter, his phone sitting untouched beside him. A part of him dreaded picking it up, knowing it would eventually bring news from the hospital, but for now he allowed himself this moment of quiet. He looked at the dog, whose soulful eyes followed his every move. "You've got a big heart, don't you, buddy?" Ethan said softly. As if in response, the pit bull thumped its tail against the floor, causing the kitten to stir. It stretched its tiny paws, mewing faintly, before curling back into the dog's fur. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. A rescue rescuing another. Never thought I'd see the day. The peace was interrupted by the buzz of Ethan's phone. His heart jumped, and he grabbed it quickly, the caller ID showing the hospital's number. Swallowing hard, he answered. "Mr. Harper?" The nurse's voice was calm but professional. "Your brother is awake. He's asking for you." Relief and fear crashed over Ethan in equal measure. He hurriedly got dressed, glancing back at the pit bull and kitten before heading to the door. "I'll be back soon," he said, though the words felt inadequate. The dog tilted its head as if understanding, but Ethan couldn't linger. His brother needed him. At the hospital, Ethan found Daniel propped up in bed, his face pale and bruised, but his eyes alert. "Took you long enough," Daniel said, his voice hoarse but teasing. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, sinking into the chair beside him. "Don't scare me like that again, Danny," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're all I've got." Daniel's smile faded slightly, and he gave a small nod. "I know, and I'm sorry." They talked quietly for a while, the weight of the accident hanging between them. Daniel explained what he remembered. A truck losing control on the highway, the sudden impact, and then nothing. "I thought that was it, Ethan. I thought I wasn't going to make it." Ethan gripped his brother's hand tightly. "You did, and that's all that matters." When Ethan returned home later that evening, he was greeted by the sight of the pit bull and kitten waiting by the door. The dog's tail wagged furiously, and the kitten mewed loudly, darting between Ethan's feet. It was the first time in days that Ethan felt something resembling normalcy. He knelt down, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You've been holding down the fort, huh?" The pit bull responded with a happy bark, and Ethan chuckled. "Good job, buddy." Over the next few days, the routine they developed became a source of comfort for Ethan. Each morning he would check on Daniel at the hospital, bringing updates about the dog and kitten that seemed to lift his brother's spirits. "You're turning into a regular Dr. Doolittle," Daniel joked during one visit, his laugh more genuine than it had been in a long time. But even as things seemed to improve, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It was a quiet, gnawing dread that kept him up at night, staring at the ceiling as the dog snored softly beside him. That unease came to a head one afternoon when Ethan took the pit bull for a walk by the lake. The water shimmered under the midday sun, and the dog trotted happily at his side. Ethan had been meaning to name him, but nothing had felt quite right. Buddy was the name on the tag, but it didn't seem to fit. "What about Lucky?" Ethan mused aloud. The dog barked once, wagging his tail, and Ethan laughed. "Yeah, Lucky it is." As they reached the dock where Ethan had first pulled Lucky from the water, His phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered, expecting another routine update about Daniel, but the voice on the other end was hesitant, the tone immediately setting Ethan on edge. "Mr. Harper," the nurse began, "I'm afraid there's been a complication with your brother." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "What kind of complication?" he demanded, his voice rising. "He's stable for now, but his injuries were more severe than we initially realized. We'll need to perform another surgery. It's risky." Ethan's knees buckled, and he sank onto the dock, his free hand gripping Lucky's leash tightly. The dog sensed his distress, pressing its head against Ethan's side. Tears stung his eyes as he listened to the nurse explain the procedure. It felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him, the fragile hope he'd been holding on to, slipping away. "I'll be there," Ethan said finally, his voice barely audible. As he ended the call, he looked down at Lucky, who stared back with unwavering loyalty. "Looks like you're not the only one who needed saving," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. He hugged the dog tightly, letting the tears fall. Ethan's drive back to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Lucky sat quietly in the passenger seat, his calm presence grounding Ethan's spiraling thoughts. The nurse's words echoed in his mind. "It's risky." The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, and for the first time, he felt truly helpless. Arriving at St. Mary's, Ethan hurried through the familiar halls to find the surgeon waiting for him. The man's face was serious but compassionate. "Mr. Harper, your brother's condition has worsened. The internal injuries are more extensive than we initially thought. The surgery is critical, but there are significant risks." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What are his chances?" he asked, his voice strained. The doctor hesitated. "It's difficult to say, but we'll do everything we can." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He watched as the surgeon disappeared down the hall, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. Lucky wasn't there to comfort him this time, and the emptiness was almost unbearable. Hours passed like days. Ethan sat in the waiting room, staring blankly at the walls. Memories of his brother flooded his mind, their childhood adventures, their fights, and the times they leaned on each other when life got tough. Daniel was more than his brother. He was his best friend. The thought of losing him felt like losing a part of himself. Just as Ethan felt he couldn't take another moment, his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Willis, the vet. He had forgotten to update her about Lucky. Guilt gnawed at him as he read the message. "How's Lucky doing? Let me know if you need any advice. He seems like a fighter." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, "He's doing great. I think he's the one keeping me going right now." After sending the message, Ethan leaned back in his chair. He realized how much Lucky had become a part of his life in such a short time. Saving that dog had given him a sense of purpose when everything felt out of control. The doors to the operating room finally opened, and the surgeon emerged, pulling off his mask. His expression was grave, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. "We've stabilized him," the surgeon said, "but it was touch and go for a while. He's in recovery now, but the next 48 hours will be critical. He's not out of the woods yet." Ethan nodded, relief and fear warring within him. "Can I see him?" "Just for a few minutes," the surgeon replied. "He'll need rest." Ethan followed the nurse to Daniel's room, his heart pounding with every step. When he entered, he saw his brother lying pale and still, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed. He looked fragile, but he was alive. "Hey, Danny," Ethan said softly, sitting beside the bed. "You scared me there, man." His voice cracked, and he wiped his eyes quickly. "You've got to pull through this. I can't do this without you." As he sat there, Ethan thought about Lucky. The dog had survived against the odds, and somehow that gave Ethan hope. If Lucky could fight his way back from the brink, maybe Daniel could too. When Ethan returned home that night, Lucky greeted him at the door, tail wagging and eyes bright. The kitten mewed from its spot on the couch, and Ethan couldn't help but smile, despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "Good to see you too, buddy," Ethan said, crouching to rub Lucky's head. The dog licked his face, his excitement contagious. Ethan sank onto the couch, letting Lucky and the kitten curl up beside him. For a while he simply sat there, feeling the warmth of their presence. Looking at Lucky, Ethan said, "You know, you've been through hell and back, but you're still here. You don't give up, do you?" Lucky tilted his head, his soulful eyes meeting Ethan's. "Maybe I need to learn a thing or two from you." The thought lingered as Ethan drifted off to sleep, the weight of the day slowly lifting. In the quiet of the night, surrounded by the steady breaths of Lucky and the kitten, Ethan allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Ethan woke up to the soft morning light streaming through the windows and the warm weight of Lucky leaning against his side. The kitten had nestled on his chest, purring softly. For the first time in what felt like weeks, he felt a moment of calm. But the calm was fleeting. The reality of Daniel's condition and the uncertainty of the days ahead loomed large in his mind. He brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen as Lucky padded in, tail wagging. "Morning, boy," Ethan murmured, pouring a cup and scratching the dog's head. Lucky's eyes followed him intently, as if sensing the tension that Ethan carried. Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. He snatched it up, his pulse quickening at the sight of the hospital's number. "Hello? Mr. Harper, this is Nurse Kelly from St. Mary's. Your brother is stable, but his condition remains critical. We recommend you come in today to discuss his care plan." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "I'll be there," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Lucky sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the window as if contemplating the world outside. Ethan glanced at him, finding comfort in his presence. "You've been through your own battles," Ethan said aloud. "Maybe that's why you get it." When he arrived at the hospital, the nurse led him to a small consultation room where the doctor was waiting. The atmosphere was heavy, and Ethan braced himself for what was coming. "Ethan," the doctor began gently, "your brother has made it through the most critical phase, but he's far from out of the woods. His injuries are severe, and his recovery will be long and difficult. We need to discuss options for long-term care." The words hit Ethan like a blow. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "What are you saying? That he might not recover?" The doctor hesitated. "It's possible, but not guaranteed. He has a chance, Ethan. It's going to take time, effort, and resources." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. The thought of Daniel being stuck in a hospital bed indefinitely was almost unbearable. But giving up wasn't an option. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. Later that day, Ethan sat by Daniel's bedside, watching his brother's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. "They say it's going to be a long road," Ethan said quietly. "But you're a Harper. You're tough as nails. We don't quit, remember?" As if in response, Daniel's fingers twitched faintly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to light a small spark of hope in Ethan's chest. When Ethan returned home that evening, Lucky and the kitten greeted him at the door, their enthusiasm lifting his spirits. He knelt down, letting Lucky lick his face, and laughed despite himself. "You're the only thing keeping me sane. You know that?" Over dinner, Ethan's thoughts drifted. He had been so focused on Daniel that he hadn't considered what would come next for Lucky. He couldn't keep calling him the stray he saved. It was clear by now that Lucky had become part of his life. "You're more than just Lucky," Ethan said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You're a fighter. Maybe that's what I should call you, Pam. Champ." "What do you think?" Lucky barked, his tail wagging furiously. Ethan chuckled. "Champ it is." The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits and quiet evenings at home with Champ and the kitten, who Ethan had begun calling Pip. The three of them had become an unlikely little family, and despite the chaos of life, Ethan found comfort in their presence. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch with Champ at his feet, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. He had gone from feeling utterly lost to finding purpose in caring for Champ, Pip, and his brother. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was one worth fighting for. Champ nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, breaking his train of thought. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked. The dog stared at him with those soulful eyes, as if to say, "Keep going. Don't give up." Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, you're right. We've come this far. No turning back now." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, and that was enough. The following week brought a mix of progress and heartache. Daniel's recovery showed signs of improvement, but the road ahead remained uncertain. Ethan spent his days splitting time between the hospital and home, where Champ and Pip became his emotional anchors. Every evening, he returned to their wagging tails and soft purrs, finding solace in their unconditional companionship. One rainy morning, Ethan sat at Daniel's bedside, watching his brother sleep. The rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the room, a reminder of how precarious life could be. As he adjusted the blanket over Daniel, the faintest whisper broke the silence. "Ethan." His heart leapt. "Danny, I'm here," he said, leaning closer. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, their usual brightness dulled, but present. "You've been here the whole time?" he rasped. Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "I'm not going anywhere." A weak smile crossed Daniel's face. "You're stubborn as hell, you know that." "And you're not allowed to give up," Ethan shot back, his voice thick with emotion. "We're Harpers. We fight." Daniel's hand moved slightly, reaching for Ethan's. The gesture spoke volumes even as words failed him. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the flicker of real hope. That afternoon, Ethan returned home, exhausted but lighter. Champ and Pip were waiting by the door as usual, their excitement infectious. "All right, you two," Ethan said with a tired smile. "Let's get some food." As he prepared their meals, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a message from the hospital. He frowned, his chest tightening as he read, "Urgent. Please call us as soon as possible." His heart sank. Grabbing his keys, Ethan bolted out the door, Champ barking after him. The drive to the hospital felt like a lifetime, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When he arrived, the nurse met him in the hallway. Her expression was grave. "Mr. Harper, your brother, he took a turn for the worse. We tried everything, but—" She hesitated, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Ethan's legs buckled, and he leaned against the wall for support. The words didn't seem real, echoing hollowly in his mind. He had been so focused on the fight, so sure they'd have more time. The finality of it crushed him. The days that followed were a blur of grief. The house felt emptier than ever, despite Champ and Pip's constant presence. Ethan struggled to find purpose in the small routines that had once grounded him. Each morning, he visited the lake, sitting quietly at the spot where he had pulled Champ from the water. It became a place of reflection, a reminder of life's fragility and resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on the porch with Champ lying at his feet and Pip curled in his lap. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Ethan broke the silence, his voice quiet but steady. "You know, Champ," he began, running a hand through the dog's fur, "saving you wasn't just about you. It was about me, too. I think I needed you as much as you needed me." Champ lifted his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was a depth to his gaze, a silent understanding that words couldn't capture. Ethan looked down at Pip, who was purring softly. "And you, Pip, you're a fighter too. You both are." For the first time since Daniel's passing, Ethan allowed himself to cry. It wasn't the uncontrollable grief of loss, but the bittersweet release of gratitude for the love he had shared, the memories he had made, and the unexpected family he had found. Months passed, and life slowly found a new rhythm. Ethan began volunteering at the local animal shelter, inspired by Champ's journey and the bond they had formed. He shared his story with others, hoping to change the way people saw pit bulls and remind them of the power of second chances. Champ and Pip remained his constant companions, their presence a daily reminder that even in the darkest times there is light to be found. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan and Champ stood at the edge of the lake, the water shimmering in the sunlight. Ethan tossed a stick, and Champ bounded after it, his tail wagging furiously. Watching him play, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. As Champ trotted back, the stick clutched proudly in his jaws, Ethan knelt down to meet him. "You saved me. You know that?" he said softly, rubbing Champ's head. The dog licked his face, his tail wagging as if to say, "We saved each other." Ethan smiled, the weight on his heart finally lifting. In that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. And don't forget, if you have your own story about your dog, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Let's spread messages of courage and hope together.